And at this point, I believe we are ready to get started. So good evening and welcome to the special meeting of council for Monday, December the 5th, 2022. We will now stand for O Canada and a moment of reflection.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command, car ton bras s'est porté le pays, il s'est porté la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Please be seated. I will now look to Councillor Townsend to read the land acknowledgement.
I think I'm going to be reading it today.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. I believe I'm looking to Councillor Ratzlaff.
Thanks. The land on which council meets today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Acknowledging this is a reminder that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people.
Thank you, Councillor. We will move in very quickly into my initial remarks, and then we can get on with the purpose of the evening. For the public, the city is facilitating this evening an opportunity for residents to provide questions and comments to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. So after tonight and up to tonight, questions regarding this evening's presentation can be emailed to clerks@stcatharines.ca. The clerk's office has been receiving those over the last 10 days, but will continue to receive them after the presentations this evening. Those questions will be shared with the MOECP, and written responses from the MOECP will be provided to council, available on the city's website, and shared via email with those who submitted a question. For those residents who want more information about the future of 282 to 285 Ontario Street, including the city's action plan and Ontario Street Corridor secondary plan, please visit www.stcatharines.ca/282-285 Ontario Street. And you can reach that from the main stcatharines.ca webpage as well. As a reminder for our councillors, for both items on the agenda, there are no staff reports, and staff will not be making presentations this evening. In accordance with council's procedures, councillors are permitted to ask questions of the presenters, but shall not make statement to nor enter into debate with the presenters. Questions are to be limited to the items before council this evening, and if councillors have questions that are not related to the items on tonight's agendas, those questions can be emailed to staff. Members are also limited to speaking once to each item for 5 minutes for each item. Following these procedures will ensure that all members have an opportunity to ask questions of the presenters, and I will be sticking as closely to those guidelines as possible to ensure that technical questions are able to be sent through and answered in good time by the ministry representatives that are forwarded to us. So we'll get on to item number 1, which is the adoption of the agenda, and I will look to the clerk.
Thank you. There are no amendments to this evening's agenda.
Excellent. So can I have a motion to move the agenda? Councillor Garcia, seconded by Councillor Stevens. All those in favor? Opposed? And that is carried unanimously. We're on to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest this evening? All right, seeing none, then we will move right into item number 3. And 3.1, the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks regarding 2022 ministry sampling results at 282 Ontario Street. And I will now call upon Kim Groombridge, the Manager, Drinking Water and Environmental Compliance Division, Niagara District Office, Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, to present regarding the 2022 ministry sampling results for 282 Ontario Street.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm happy to be here tonight. Yeah, I think we can go right to the second slide. So the purpose tonight, let me just move this, there we go. The purpose tonight is to provide you all with an update of the ministry's monitoring over the past year of 282 Ontario Street, which is the east side of Ontario Street, the former General Motors property. And its monitoring occurred following some actions by the owner as part of their work plan to remove contaminated sediment from sewers on the property. Next slide, please. So recognizing that some of you have not been present for previous presentations, I've pulled in a couple of our old slides just to give you an overview of our role in the process and a bit of background. So the ministry's role in regards to brownfields is to respond to complaints and pollution incident reports. And when we find in responding to those complaints that there's been an indication of offsite impacts, then we have the authority to require that the owner take action to address them. And in regards to brownfields themselves, we review risk assessments and or records of site condition that are submitted to us for development purposes. And during that review, we ensure that the owners and responsible parties are following all of our guidelines and regulations to ensure that human health and the environment is protected during the development process. So for this specific file or issue, our role here is to ensure that the owner of the property retains a qualified person to develop and carry out a work plan to address the concern that has been identified, which is the discharge of PCB contamination from the property into storm sewers off of the property. We also are assessing the progress of the work plan actions, and we're evaluating, ultimately we're going to be evaluating the environmental improvements on 12 Mile Creek once this project, as well as a couple of others that are upstream of this project, are complete. And it's important to note for the brownfield process is that remediations are typically proponent driven. The ministry's involvement occurs either when we get to the stage where we're reviewing the submissions for records of site condition or risk assessments, unless in this instance there is an indication of offsite impact. It's important to note also that the record of site condition is required for the property prior to proceeding with a change in land use to a more sensitive use. And filing that record of site condition ensures that any potential on-site risks to human health or the environment are identified and are addressed before the land use change. So in order to file a record of site condition, a proponent can choose to do a full cleanup to ministry standards, or they can conduct a risk assessment and recommend risk management measures to protect human health and the environment. Next slide, please. So a bit of background on this property. We all know that General Motors operated there for a large number of years, starting in 1929 and closing in 2010. On the west side of the property, there was an oil grit separator that collected stormwater from the site, as well as cooling water while it was operating, and treated it to remove grit and any oil material before discharging directly into 12 Mile Creek. On the east side of the property, there was another oil grit separator, or there is still, It has the exact same function. However, the discharge is into a municipal sewer that ultimately ends up in 12 Mile Creek. Surrounding the property, there's a large number of municipal catch basins that collect the city road runoff from the residential properties and discharge into the same municipal sewers that the East Plant discharges into. The site was purchased in 2014 by Bayshore Group, and prior to this, while the plant was operating, the ministry was in there inspecting on a regular basis, and we've been involved on a regular basis since Bayshore purchased the property. One of our roles was to ensure that prior to the sale, that the PCB storage site on the property was properly decommissioned, and any hazardous or liquid industrial waste was removed prior to any demolition activities taking place. During the initial demolition phase, between 2015 and 2017, we did receive a few complaints. I believe it was 5, yeah. And they were predominantly related to dust. And we did validate those complaints, and we required the company at the time to implement dust management measures, which were effective based on the fact that we did not receive further dust complaints at the time. And in 2020, the City of St. Catharines reached out to us to relay a number of concerns that they've been receiving about potential impacts from the property. And they asked the ministry's assistance to evaluate whether or not impacts due to dust or runoff from the site were occurring. And just a bit of a recap, the air monitoring that we did as a result of that request indicated that there were no off-site impacts and that there was no difference between upwind and downwind air quality. And one of the main concerns was about asbestos, and there was no asbestos found in any of the air monitoring samples. And as far as water monitoring goes, as it's why we're here today, we did find PCBs in the municipal storm sewer that were above levels that are acceptable, and we've been working with the company and their consultants to ensure that they get a work plan to make improvements to that and ultimately stop that discharge. Next slide, please. So our 2022 sampling was really it was to evaluate one of the significant phases of the work plan, which was to remove some contaminated sediments from the manhole on the property that on the map that you see there is identified as MHSTE 35 or manhole 35. In December 2021, the company's consultants undertook a remediation to remove contaminated sediments from that manhole. We also took samples downstream of that location in manhole STE 51, which is the intake to the oil grit separator on the site, or the upstream manhole to the intake to the oil grit separator, as well as the manhole STE 53, which is the point of discharge from the oil grit separator to the municipal sewers. The other location that we sampled was off of Woodruff Avenue, the last manhole before the discharge to 12 Mile Creek for the municipal sewer that not only has the oil grit separator discharge from the East Plant, but also the neighboring residential areas sewer shed discharges as well. The parameters that we tested were PCBs. It was our main interest in all of the locations. And we also took some additional analyses for petroleum hydrocarbons and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in the oil grit separator discharge at manhole 53. And that's to compare to our previous sampling events to ensure that there has been no changes. As you can see, we did a dry event, a snow melt event, and a rain event, which gives us a good cross-section of the different conditions that you would expect to see of the stormwater quality in the sewers. Next slide, please. So this slide is just an overview of the results. As you can see, for all three sampling events, there were PCB exceedances of our provincial water quality objectives at a number of the sites, not all of the sites at each event. But for the other parameters from the manhole SDE 53, we really found it was consistent with previous findings that the water quality, with the exception of PCBs, was either equal to or better than what you would expect to see in urban stormwater. Next slide, please. So here are the detailed results from this year's sampling, and they're the PCB results. Again, a reminder for folks who haven't been to previous presentations that PCBs are found in waterways throughout the province. There was widespread historic use of that particular chemical in industry. And the ministry itself has been undertaking track down work on 12 Mile Creek since the early 2000s. And what we've established for 12 Mile Creek is a PCB threshold of 10 nanograms per liter. And below that value, during dry conditions, you would expect that 10 nanograms per liter is just background. When there's wet events, our studies have indicated that you could expect to see PCB concentrations above 20 nanograms per liter, and this is in 12 Mile Creek, based on our historical studies. What we found recently is that there have been no results in 12 Mile Creek itself that have been above that threshold. All of our results have been below it, and the results that you're seeing on this page are in the storm sewer. None of these results are in 12 Mile Creek. So starting at the first site, manhole 35, you can see that the threshold, which again is a threshold for the creek itself, it's not intended for a storm sewer, but we're using it for the basis just for comparison to determine the progress in the work plan. But the concentrations in the sewer on the property were quite elevated, significantly elevated. Manhole 51, which is just upstream of the oil grit separator, again, is quite a bit elevated above what we would like to see. Manhole 53, which is coming out of the oil grit separator. We have a few more samples there in 2020 as well to compare to, but again, consistently above what we would like to see. And the variability that you're seeing there is expected between dry events, wet events, and melt events. They're all different conditions, so you would expect to see different concentrations in the water. But the good news is, at the Woodruff Avenue manhole, on two of the events in 2022, we didn't detect any PCBs. And on the rain event in March of 2022, it was at 23 nanograms per liter, again, in the storm sewer, which is really close to what you would expect to be background in 12 Mile Creek itself, and much less than what we saw back in November of 2020. Next slide, please. So this slide is updated from the previous slides that were presented to give some context to what we've been seeing throughout our track down work in 12 Mile Creek watershed. The first group there is the sampling that has been done in the Beaver Dams Creek and Lake Gibson area. And the three sample locations identified there resulted in very large scale PCB remediation projects that have been completed in the years identified. Along the Old Welland Canal area of the watershed, there's still ongoing remedial work for two storm sewer discharges at Clifford Creek and Carter Creek. And then at 12 Mile Creek along the GM property, you can see in the early 2000s data that we had is very consistent with the 2020 data for the west outfall for the former GM plant. And you can see for the Woodruff Avenue manhole, it was much higher, as I mentioned earlier, in 2020 than what we saw in the 2022 results. So we're seeing improvement. Next slide, please. So to interpret the results as a bottom line, the concentrations that we're seeing both in the manholes on the property and discharging from the property, the PCB concentrations are still significantly above both provincial water quality objectives and the threshold that we've established for 12 Mile Creek. Again, these are in the sewer, not in the creek, but they're high enough to warrant work be done to address those sources. The city Woodruff manhole just off Woodruff Avenue, again, is much lower than what we saw in November 2020. The number we saw this year is actually just marginally above the threshold. It's right in the vicinity of what you would expect to see as background in 12 Mile Creek, and much less than what we'd seen previously. So that it's really only a couple samples, so it's difficult to say that this is actually an improvement. However, it's certainly not going in the wrong direction, which is a good thing. Next slide. So in conclusion, as I said, the results for manholes 35, 51, and 53, which are associated with 282 Ontario Street, are still significantly higher than what we would like to see, and additional actions are required to stop that discharge into the stormwater from the site. And the next steps are that the owner has updated their work plan with an alternate approach to stop the discharge to the storm sewer, and you're going to be seeing that presentation shortly. And in the longer term, once the PCB cleanup projects along 12 Mile Creek are complete, our ministry experts are planning to reassess both the water, the sediment, and the biota of 12 Mile Creek to evaluate the environmental improvement as a result of all of these remediation projects that have occurred over the years. And in respect to the risk to public health and the general concern in the public, this contaminated stormwater that we're talking about is in the sewers. The concentrations that are a concern are inaccessible to the general public. And we've engaged Niagara Public Health, and they believe that there's no increased risk of adverse health to persons living in the vicinity of the former GM plant based on the monitoring that we've done. So with that, I'm just open to any questions, either now or we can wait until after the MTE presentation.
All right, so at this time, I will leave it open to questions. I see Councillor Garcia has his hand up. If councillors do have questions they want to ask, please use the raise hand function. I've got Councillor Ratzlaff, Councillor Williamson, Councillor Kushner, so we have a list populated. As a reminder, councillors, you do have 5 minutes. Feel free to ask any questions. Anything that you do not get to this evening can be forwarded to the MOE CP to get those responses. So I will look first to Councillor Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For you, just some procedural clarification in terms of the 5 minutes. Are you saying, like I have several questions, I should post all those questions first, even without an answer? Is that what you're saying?
So I would say no. Ask your questions. If there is a question, I mean, it's entirely possible that Ms. Groombridge will not be able to answer a question here and may need to take that question back. I should rephrase the way I said that. I'm going to try and offer councillors as much leeway as possible to ask those questions. I do want them to get out this evening. I guess my concern, and what I had mentioned at the beginning, I don't want us to get into a back and forth with the presenter. That's really it. But if there are clarifying questions, obviously I want you to ask those to make sure that we're asking the questions and getting the answers we're looking for. That's all.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mayor. And just for the information for the new councillors, while this site is in St. Patrick's Ward, of course, it really affects Port Lucie Ward because everything flows down 12 Mile Creek into Martindale Pond and the lake. So question number one for you to Ms. Groombridge, and thank you for the presentation. You said at the beginning that the ministry inspected the site regularly during its operation. I assume that meant regularly, as you said. So why was the PCB leaks not detected earlier than 2020?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a fair question, Councillor Garcia. Our inspection program doesn't involve going into storm sewers. This is a unique situation where we were addressing concerns and fears from the public. Our inspection programs look to assess compliance with environmental regulations and would involve, for instance, they had a PCB storage site, and there's a number of requirements to ensure that that storage site was being operated in compliance with the regulations, and that's what we would go in and inspect. They had a number of air discharges that had a long list of conditions for them to be able to operate, and those conditions would be what we go in and inspect. The discharge to the storm sewer is really something that we may never know when that started. It could be a result of the demolition, it could be a result of historical practices, it could be a combination of both. But the inspections themselves wouldn't be designed to identify something like that. While it was operating, we had to ensure that the activities that were taking place were in compliance with the regulations.
Thank you for that. And for you, Mr. Mayor, I think we've all heard about the Hamilton Harbor, where they discovered recently that there was a pipe leaking raw sewage, and they estimated it's been there for many years, and the leaders that have been discharged. Do you have any kind of an estimate of how much, however we measure PCBs have indeed leaked over the year?
There is no way to evaluate that. Again, we don't know when this started.
Okay, and one more question at least. Since the PCBs do end up in 12 Mile Creek eventually, and my understanding is that they accumulate either in the sediment at the bottom or in animals such as fish, will or has the ministry tested the fish in Martindale Pond and the creek to see if they're PCB contaminated? Because we get a lot of people fishing in Martindale Pond.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, excellent question. I'm glad you asked that. As I indicated in previous presentations, the ministry's guide to eating Ontario fish is published every 2 years. It is available online for the public to reference, and anybody eating fish in Ontario should be referencing that guide in order to eat safe amounts of fish. And Martindale Pond is one of the sites that is identified in that guide and has restrictions on eating a number of species of fish. PCBs is identified as one of the limiting parameters and has been in place again for many, many years, as is the restriction for many other watersheds throughout Ontario.
Well, thank you for that. And for you, does the ministry post any signage to that effect? I mean, we can't really expect that people are going to be looking at that guide before they go fishing, right?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the Ontario Guide to Eating Fish is advertised to fishermen throughout the province, and the expectation is that they reference the guide before eating fish that they catch.
Okay, thank you. One last question. I believe you said that additional actions are required to stop the PCBs and that the owner has updated the work plan to stop the discharge. Any idea how long will that take, and will you be able to share that, or will the owner share that work plan with council?
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I believe that's part of MTE's presentation following mine.
And I will just interject, yes, it is a part of the next presentation, Councillor.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Mayor. Bye.
All right, thank you, Councillor Garcia. Up next is Councillor Ratzlaff.
Thank you, Mayor. Through the Mayor, thanks for the presentation, Kim. Just a few questions. The first, in your presentation, you talked about next steps and waiting until the cleanup was finished before reassessing. And we've waited a long time for the cleanup to start. And so I'm wondering what that timeline looks like for you exactly. Like I have seen in the next presentation that the MTE does have a plan for trying to stop the PCBs or the runoff from continuing to go into the river. But, you know, that could take, we'd have to ask them how long that's going to take. But, like, would it be possible for you to test again next year and we'd be back here in the fall to hear an update just so that we can, you know, assure residents who live around there that work's being done or that we're keeping an eye on what's happening in the sewers?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the monitoring that I indicated is much broader than just monitoring this project. It's going to be following the Clifford and Carter Creek remedial work as well as this project, and it's to compare to the work that we did in the early 2000s to evaluate the overall environmental improvement. As far as monitoring the progress with this work plan, additional monitoring is certainly on the table. It's really going to depend on the progress and the direction that the project takes. It's not being planned at the moment, but certainly if it's necessary to evaluate the effectiveness of the work plan, then it would be something we would consider.
Thank you. Through the mayor, what would indicate it's necessary, I guess? How would we as councillors know that that's the case from your perspective?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, again, the responsibility for this is on the owner of the site, and we're monitoring the progress with their work plan to address the concern. So what it would depend upon is the work that they've submitted to us and our evaluation of the work that they've done. If we have any concerns, then we'll go out and do our own evaluation.
All right, thanks. Next question has to do with groundwater. What is the ministry's role to play when it comes to groundwater? I looked at the presentation that's going to be given us in a moment, and it looks like they are testing the groundwater, but does the ministry have any role to assure that tests are done properly? Yeah.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Our role for any monitoring is to assess the off-site impacts. So groundwater is no different. So when doing monitoring of groundwater on the site, it's the evaluation of whether or not it's traveling or migrating off-site, any contaminants migrating off-site, which is the ministry's concern. All of the reports that the owner's consultant are preparing in response to the work plan actions that they're taking are being reviewed by ministry experts. And again, if there's any concern about the quality, then the ministry would take a number of actions, which could include asking the company to redo samples, to provide quality assurance information on the results. And I'm glad you asked the groundwater question, simply because we've had it a number of times. In this situation, it's really the surface water entering the sewers that's the main concern. Groundwater, the direction of travel for the groundwater is to 12 Mile Creek. So the potential sensitive receptor is 12 Mile Creek. We're not seeing an impact in 12 Mile Creek. In addition, the site is municipally serviced, so there's nobody using groundwater for residential purposes. So groundwater is really a lesser priority than what we're focusing on now. It's certainly a piece of the puzzle and part of the process for the brownfield redevelopment. But as far as off-site concerns go, it's not really a ministry focus right now.
All right. Thanks for that. One last question. I'm just wondering, I'm curious as to why this meeting was canceled in the first place. It's an important site I was knocking on doors when it was canceled, and my ward is GM, or the former GM site is in my ward. And so yeah, can you give us any insight into why it took, requests from the city and then requests from our MPP to get the report back to council here?
All I can do is greatly apologize for the ministry's decision to delay this presentation. It was always the intention to do this presentation. I'm very happy to be here today. Right from the very beginning, when the city reached out to the ministry for assistance, we've been working very, very closely with the city staff. It's been a priority for us to make sure that we address the concerns of the city and in the community. And it's unfortunate that it got delayed, but there was no intention to ever not come here. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm happy to continue the good working relationship that we've established.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councillor Ratzlaff. And I will just say, Ms. Groombridge, we're thankful to have you here as well. And from my perspective, and I know many members of council, I appreciate the good working relationship that you've established with our staff and our staff have established with yours to make sure that we can keep moving forward on this file. I will now look to Councillor Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm one of the people that's appreciative of the fact that you're here, Ms. Groombridge. Thank you. When I was a kid in school, the environmental issues were just coming to the fore. The mantra was, the solution to pollution is not dilution, meaning that the emphasis should not be us measuring what's in the waters of Martindale Pond or Lake Ontario or even 12 Mile Creek, but what's flowing off this site, and to me the question is, shouldn't our main concern be to eliminate or mitigate completely any contaminants flowing into the creek?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the short answer is yes. We also use that same mantra, and that's why we're measuring samples in the sewer system as opposed to 12 Mile Creek. And we'll continue to do that until we're assured that there isn't a source entering 12 Mile Creek. Even though we're not detecting it in 12 Mile Creek, we know that it's a very persistent chemical and it bioaccumulates, and that's our main concern. The reason we're here today is we're still detecting it in the sewers, and regardless of the fact that we're not detecting it in the in 12 Mile Creek, it's important that we address the source.
Thank you. And yeah, PCB seems to be our main focus and the hydrocarbons. But is there other contaminants? Like I'm told that there's lots of asbestos when they're doing brake linings that were dumped over the edge of the bank into the 12 Mile Creek. And is there anything we're missing here that we should be, that maybe isn't our focus?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, all of our water sampling have indicated that, again, the water's either as good or better than typical urban stormwater quality, as far as, with the exception of PCBs, of course. As far as asbestos goes, Ministry of Labor and Trades and Skills Development have regulations for the appropriate management and disposal of asbestos. And it's really their jurisdiction to ensure that those requirements are followed. And we've been assured that the appropriate plans for managing asbestos have been followed.
Thank you. And then the problematic maintenance hole, I guess is the correct term now, is 53 at Thomas and Pleasant Avenue. And that's close to the site that was recently approved for development. Will that have to be, we have to see significant improvement there before development is allowed, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, the brownfields process requires that a record of site condition be submitted before any change in land use to a more sensitive land use. So it will definitely have to be addressed before proceeding.
Okay, and then Ms. Groombridge, Mr. Mayor, through you, one of the measures seems to be surface water threshold of 10 nanograms per liter. Well, we know that PCBs basically sink. The more important measure would be in the silt and the sediment, wouldn't it? And maybe in the flesh of aquatic creatures.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. All of those, the water sampling is the most convenient right now. In the long term, the ministry intends to do all of the different media, both the sediments, the water, and the fish tissue. Fish tissues is measured on an ongoing basis for our guide to eating Ontario fish, but we'll also be completing a more comprehensive survey just to evaluate the environmental improvement in the creek from our earlier monitoring in the early 2000s that brought us to all of the track down work that we've done. Okay, thank you. And then it looks like these the machine pits where there's probably accumulation of oil and who knows what else, cleaning fluids and all the lubricants. I worked in the plant for a summer, so I saw what went on. And it was actually mostly handled well, but I'm asking questions. The ministry oversaw those being cleaned up, so they were, once before they were backfilled, that it was determined that they were remediated to the appropriate standard. Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, it's all been part of the owner's consultant's work plan, and they've been submitting regular reports to us on their progress. And then, what about the possibility that there's buried oil drums or barrels containing? Has there been any, like, I don't know what technology is used or what's affordable, but ground penetrating radar or something to find out where there may be hidden pockets of contaminants underground? Through you, Mr. Mayor, I've heard no indication of any buried materials on the property other than the operations at the site. Again, through the record of site condition process, if they're going to develop the site to a more sensitive land use, they'll have to do the full phase 1 and 2 environmental assessments and record of site condition, ultimately to demonstrate that the site can be used for a more sensitive land use.
Okay. I know there's other people with questions, so I'll just stick to one or two more. You mentioned these other sites upstream that that have been remediated. By remediating, I take it we're dredging out material and relocating it to other sites. Is that what generally is happening there at beaver dams, etc.?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, it was there was a number of activities that were undertaken. There's, like I said, 3 different sites. Some of it involved dredging as for the remediation. Some of it involved assessing barriers to ensure that where they're currently contained, it's going to stay contained. It's all 3 of them had different components to the remediation. Every different remediation has a site-specific assessment to determine what's needed.
Right, and I think at one of the previous meetings, you educated me the fact that where we draw our drinking water from, which goes to the plant at DeQ, we have a separate channel leading from the Welland Canal above Allenberg Bridge there to where our water is treated. Is there samples taken in the canal before where we get what's ultimately our drinking water before it's treated? South of Allenberg Bridge and the canal, and you may not have that information handy, but I gather that it's done.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, raw water quality is certainly assessed. The sample location, I'm not aware of where that's taken.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. And I will say, if you have further questions, please do send them through. And if there are additional questions you need responses to, we will make sure that they're passed along. Councillor Kushner, followed by Councillor McPherson and Councillor Stevens. Councillor Kushner.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have 2 questions. One, when we consider the development on the east side, there's concern that that development should not take place until the entire site was remediated. And we were told that that was not necessary. The remediation should be for the site where the development was to take place. Can you comment on that, please?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm not a planner. I can't comment on planning requirements. The requirement from the ministry to develop a property is that a record of site condition be submitted for a change to a more sensitive land use for a specific property.
Thank you. And the second question I have is you've referred to the concentration in the manholes, that they're above what you'd like. Now, if they're in the manhole, do they not eventually flow into 12 Mile Creek? And why wouldn't the concentrations be the same?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's a good question. There's a lot for the municipal sewer. Again, it's not just what you're seeing coming off the 282 Ontario Street property that's entering the sewer. There's a very wide watershed there that collects stormwater from all of the residential properties in the area as well. And that dilution is one reason why you might not see it discharging from the pipe. Another is that PCBs bind very strongly to solids. And if there's pockets of solid deposition through the sewer system, it could be settling out before it reaches the creek. It's hard to know exactly what those reasons are, what combination of them are, but it's not surprising that it would be so much less before entering the creek.
Okay, and you've indicated that PCBs convert to sediment quite quickly. Is the sediment in the manhole covers taken out?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, on the property, there already has been sediment removal for the highest concentrations that they saw on the property. As far as downstream, that MTE might be able to update you. I'm not sure what other remediations that have happened on the property, but in the sewer system, in the municipal sewer system, that has not occurred.
Thank you. You've answered the question extremely well. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councillor Kushner. Councillor McPherson, followed by Councillor Stevens, and then Councillor Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Kim, for being here. This was really great. My first question is about the NPCA testing on 12 Mile Creek. I know that they do some testing. And so my question is have you seen the results from their testing of 12 Mile Creek?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we have. For a period of time, they submit those to us, and we decreased the method detection limit to make sure that we were looking at the lowest concentrations possible. And there has been non-detect in all of the NPCA samples that they've submitted to us.
Okay, thank you. And that's an ongoing kind of situation that they regularly test and you regularly, there's regular communication really is, I guess, what I'm going for.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, it is. It's one of their normal monitoring stations. However, the detection limit has gone back to the normal range just because of the cost of doing the tests. Non-detect, there's been enough non-detects to warrant that.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is probably more for clarification for those of us who weren't around for the previous presentations or for residents, could you just, when I'm looking at the results, the couple of those of the manholes were not part of the original testing or the testing that you did in 2020. Could you just explain why they're now part of it? Yeah, just explain why they're part of it now.
Yeah, certainly. Through you, Mr. Mayor. The original sampling that we did was in order to identify that there was an issue and require a work plan. Since the work plan's been implemented and some significant work already completed, these locations were selected in order to assess the effectiveness of that work. So they've been added since as a result of that.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question, and this is again probably more just to try and get the information out to people. In the interpretation of the results, it includes the word significantly, and I don't want to get hung up too much on the semantics of it, but when I see the word significantly, and then I kind of look back at the chart that's above that slide, so slide 8, how would you describe the other examples that have been used? Like, would you say they're super significant, or like, I'm just trying to, because I know people might hear the word significantly, and when you look at the comparators of the other locations, it's not as high. So I'm just curious about the language around that.
Sure, through you, Mr. Mayor. Again, each site is evaluated individually, and in this circumstance, we're looking at sewer concentrations in sewers immediately flowing off an industrial property. In the upstream locations, those are discharges again from sewers that are being fed by the ultimate issue that we track down to. But those were the sample locations along the 12 Mile Creek sewer shed. So we do have much higher samples when we did the track down, found the problem, and required the remediation.
Okay. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for being here. Much appreciated, and thank you for your ongoing support.
No problem.
Thank you, Councillor McPherson. Councillor Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, to the presenter. So I think you answered with Councillor Kirchner's question, but I just wanted to clarify. So at like manhole site 53, when the numbers are quite high at 182, and then at Woodruff, before they go into the creek, they're down to 23. So you said the reason for that is probably because of other stormwater going in, and then therefore the results it's diluted more. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's one of the potential reasons. Again, these are grab samples at a moment in time. So as you can see at the various sampling events, and even during the same sampling event, there's variability in the results, which is expected. And there's a number of reasons for that. Again, it could be at one moment in time, there's a higher concentration of solids flowing through, and that's when we sampled. At the Woodruff Avenue manhole, again, there's a large volume of water that comes from the residential sewer shed that would definitely cause some dilution. There's a number of reasons why they would be different. And at the Woodruff discharge, again, we're encouraged that it's lower than previously, but that's only one piece of the story. The concentrations that we're seeing right at the property are what's important to us, and those numbers still need to be addressed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stevens. Councillor Townsend?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, thank you, Kim, for being here today. Really appreciate the ministry's work, and we were fortunate to meet with the minister and ministry staff at AMO this summer. And again, we are really appreciative of the working relationship that the city has with your ministry. My question is, there are residents that are concerned with air blowing contaminants that may be harmful onto their properties. Based on the finding from the ministry, it seems quite clear that there have been no contaminants found from the findings. Am I correct in saying that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, our air monitoring didn't find any reason for concern. All of our air quality standards were met.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Phillips.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and again, echoing thoughts of everyone else on council. Thanks for being here, Kim. Next steps. What are the next steps that you see as far as your ministry is concerned in relation to this situation? And furthermore, what do you see as the next steps from the owner? And can you give us a timeline? An expected timeline?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to leave that to MTE's presentation. It is the responsibility of the property owner to ensure that they address our concerns, which they are doing. And the presentation that's about to come up provides those details.
Okay, and as far as your ministry's going forward, what do you see that it's just going to be maintaining, testing until the remediation is complete to your satisfaction?
Correct. Through you, Mr. Mayor, we have been monitoring the work plan progress from the start. We're going to continue to do that. I've mentioned in previous presentations that these remediations like this can be very complicated. They take time, and they often get reevaluated through the progression of the work plan, and that's happened here. We're heading in the right direction, and we continue to get cooperation with the owner and their consultants to address all of our concerns. And I'm really happy that they're here today to share those with you as well.
Thank you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you until we get a solution. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Phillips. All right, so at this time, I will say thank you again to Ms. Groombridge for the presentation. Can I have a mover and a seconder that council receive the presentation from Ms. Groombridge? Councillor Dodge moving, seconding Councillor Phillips. All those in favor of receiving the presentation? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you again, Ms. Groombridge. Moving on to item 3.2, which is MTE Consultants, Inc. and Peters Construction Group site cleanup efforts for 282 to 285 Ontario Street. I'll now call upon Stuart Randall, the Executive Director of Civil Infrastructure at Peters Construction Group, and Thomas Jones, Manager of Environmental and Indoor Environments, MTE Consultants, to present regarding the site cleanup efforts at 282 to 285 Ontario Street.
Great, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Coming through 5 by 5.
Right. Goodness. All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Thomas Jones. I'm a senior environmental engineer and qualified person with MTE Consultants. Presenting with me today will be Stuart Randall, who's the Executive Director of Civil Infrastructure for Peters Construction. MTE and Peters have been retained on behalf of the owners to assist with the assessment and abatement of PCBs in stormwater discharge from the site, being 282 Ontario Street, the former General Motors East Plant, as outlined in the ministry's proposal. I just wanted to say thanks again for this opportunity. Our team is really excited to have this opportunity to present sort of the summary of the significant work that has been completed to both improve the general site conditions and also to present the approved approach to stopping the discharge of PCBs and other hydrocarbons and stormwater leaving the site. So thanks again for this opportunity. Hopefully this presentation will also answer some of the questions that were proposed to the ministry just a few moments ago. You can move to the next slide. Thank you. So the presentation outline, I'll be talking a little bit about the process of assessing potential sources of PCBs to stormwater on the site. I'll talk a little bit about the sampling results and other remediation and site improvement activities that have been completed over the past couple of years to improve the site. And then following my presentation, Stuart from Peters will provide some further details on the approved approach to stopping the discharge of PCBs in stormwater leaving the site. Next slide, please. I thought I'd start with this figure, which sort of outlines the study area. You can see outlined in yellow is the 282 Ontario Street property, the former GM East plant. South of that is outlined in orange is 10 Pleasant Avenue. The main sewer discharge line from the 282 Ontario Street site exits to the south, leads to 10 Pleasant Avenue, where there's an existing oil grit separator that was installed by GM. That sewer line then discharges to the municipal sewer on Thomas Street and then exits down to the near 12 Mile Creek, where it discharges near Woodruff Avenue. Next slide, please. So prior to proceeding with the details of the work completed to date, we thought it would be helpful just to include some general site photos to provide some sort of visual context for the information that I'm going to be presenting, and to give council an appreciation for the level of effort that has been completed to significantly improve the site conditions. So the next few slides include some photos of the site in early 2021 when MTE became involved in this project, some of the cleanup activities that have completed, and then following that we have some photos of just the current conditions of the site. This particular slide shows some general surface material piles that were remaining on the site from the building demolition activities. The photo on the right is one of the former GM machine pits that was mentioned, and I'll talk in a lot more detail about that going forward. Next slide, please. These two slides just show some other general photos of the site in 2021, showing the surface materials across the site, and also some liquid waste that had remained on the site. Next slide, please. So the cleanup activities have included a number of activities, which I'll talk about in more detail, but these photos just give you a sense of some of the pre-existing site conditions. So there was some significant vegetation control that was needed, solid waste removal and disposal. Next slide, please. It included decommissioning of the concrete machine pits, some of which are extremely large, and it was a pretty complicated process to decommission these pits and clean them out. So I'll talk a little bit more of that on that. Next slide, please. So these next few slides just to include some general photos of the site as it exists right now. On the left is a photo you can see along the left side of the photo where the concrete's broken up there. That's been done recently as part of the proposed solution to addressing the PCBs in stormwater, which I'll talk about a bit later. On the right is an area where there were multiple GM machine pits. So those machine pits have been removed, including removal of all the concrete and the contents of those pits. And those pits have then been backfilled. Next slide, please. These photos just show some general areas of the site where the surface materials and debris and construction waste have been removed from the site. You can see in the background of the photo on the left, the hoarding that's been placed around the site to improve the site security and safety. Next slide, please. And these are just some other photos of the site, basically showing the significant efforts that have been made to improve the surface conditions of the site. The photo on the left is another machine pit that's been decommissioned and removed. Next slide, please. So the ownership group and the management team thought it was important to let council know that communication with the regulatory agencies is paramount to our team, and that multiple lines of communication are going on behind the scenes. And as Kim mentioned, it's included ministry review of the work plans that we've submitted. We've submitted monthly updates on the work plan progress to date. More recently, we've instituted bi-weekly calls with the ministry. And then as part of the final solution to address the PCBs and stormwater issue, there's been approvals and meetings with ministry, City of St. Catharines staff, and the region of Niagara. So the work is proceeding with the knowledge, communication, and oversight from the appropriate regulatory agencies. So we just thought that would be important for council to know. Next slide, please. So as Kim mentioned, the assessment process included the preparation of multiple work plans. The initial work plan was submitted to the ministry for the review and comment in June 2021, and then updated work plans were provided in March and August of 2022 based on the results of the initial work that was completed under the June 2021 work plan. The work plan tasks generally included site cleanup and waste removal, which I talked about when I went through the photos, PCB source assessment, so sampling of various media on the site, decommissioning of the former machine pits on the site. It included an assessment of the storm sewer oil grit separator at 10 Pleasant Avenue, and then also design of a new stormwater management system for the property, which was included in the updated work plans. Next slide. So there has been numerous positive improvements and cleanup activities that have been completed at the site over the past couple of years to generally improve the quality of the site, remove hazards, remove waste, etc. So some of these have included site security and safety, so repair of fences, installation of hoarding around the site, ongoing vegetation control, removal of large demolition debris piles across the site, which included about 16,000 tons of material, which is a fairly significant volume. Installing sediment control measures for catch basins to prevent sediment from getting into the storm sewers itself, and perimeter silt fencing to prevent sediment from leaving the site. Next slide, please. And then additionally, it's included removal of liquid waste that remained on site. It included some abatement of hazardous materials remaining in the 282 Ontario Street building. It included the clean out of the 10 Pleasant Avenue oil grit separator. As Kim mentioned, it included removal of accumulated storm sewer sediment on a couple of occasions, which I'll talk about in a little more detail in some following slides. And then also demolition and backfilling of the GM machine pits. So significant works have been completed to improve the site in general. Next slide, please. So one of the work plan tasks included the sampling of various media on the site to evaluate potential sources of PCBs to stormwater. So this included sampling of concrete floor cores, just general surface materials at the site, sampling of the GM machine pit liquids, included groundwater sampling, including sample of sediments like gravel and other materials that have accumulated in the storm sewer on the site, and then also completing stormwater sampling. And MT, on behalf of the owners, has been completing stormwater sampling events monthly, both rain and dry events, at multiple locations across the site and off-site. Next slide, please. The PCB sampling results. Groundwater samples have been collected from 27 monitoring wells that have been installed across the site. This includes adjacent to storm sewers and machine pits, and in the former GM manufacturing areas. The concentrations of PCBs measured in groundwater have all been below the ministry's residential land use standard. And there's no evidence to suggest offsite migration of PCBs in groundwater, so that's a good thing. In terms of the machine pit liquids themselves, so there was a number of former machine pits on the site. The machine pit liquids were sampled and none were identified as a source of PCBs. So those machine pit liquids were removed and transported offsite for disposal at a ministry approved facility concurrent with the pit decommissioning work. Next slide, please. So PCBs were detected in some concrete core and surface material samples. PCBs were detected in accumulate sediments in the storm sewer pipes, as mentioned by the ministry. And those were identified as potential sources of PCBs to stormwater. And as outlined in the ministry presentation, PCBs were also detected above the provincial water quality objective in the storm sewer samples collected at and in the vicinity of the site. Next slide, please. Storm sewer sediment removal. So as mentioned, removal and offsite disposal of storm sewer sediment was completed on 2 occasions, in December of 2021 and then again in May of 2022 to try and improve overall stormwater quality. And following that work, decreases in the measured PCB concentrations in stormwater were observed. Next slide, please. So the concrete pits removal and general surface cleanup. So there were, at the outset, there were 26 former GM machine pits were identified. And the machine pits were initially a potential concern as a source of PCBs, but also generally just a safety concern. As I mentioned, PCBs were not detected in the pit liquid samples, so the pits themselves were not identified as a potential source of PCBs to stormwater. Some of the pits did contain oily water, as observed in that one photo that was provided earlier in the presentation. So that oily water and water in the other pits was removed and transported to a ministry-approved facility for disposal. And as mentioned, the concrete pit structures are each being removed, and then the pits are being backfilled once they're cleaned out. To date, I believe there's 22 of the 26 pits have been decommissioned, and the remaining 4 are currently underway and should be completed in the next month or so. And then once the pits are decommissioned, some additional surface cleanup is being completed concurrent with the pit backfilling activities. Next slide, please. So the overall remedial solution here is essentially to stop the discharge of stormwater from the site to the municipal storm sewer. And that is the priority of the ownership and management team who are committed to doing this. The approach essentially will include design and construction of a new temporary stormwater management system on the site, followed by terminating the connections to the municipal storm sewer altogether, including from 282 Ontario Street and from the oil grit separator at 10 Pleasant Avenue. So there'll no longer be flow of stormwater to those systems. Stuart will now provide some additional details regarding the new system, and then following Stuart's presentation, we can answer any questions that you may have.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. We appreciate the opportunity to present what is to be the final solution to offsite PCPs, including our plan and implementation of that strategy. Next slide, please. Basically, the property is bordered by Ontario Street, Carlton Street, Hague, and Pleasant. Our plan is, in essence, to terminate all off-site sewer discharge that leaves the property and basically suspending any possibility of any PCPs leaving the site, making its way into 12 Mile Creek. We anticipate construction being completed of this system by March 31st, 2023. The actual temporary stormwater management system will retain and control all of the surface stormwater generated on the site from rain events, runoff, melt, and so on. It controls both the quality and the cleanliness of the water that will eventually be discharged once processed through a treatment system. Next slide. This basically shows the plan of how we're going to achieve clean water discharge from the site, which is to include the construction of a stormwater pond, holding pond, and the perimeter swales and berms that will help corral the water into the pond during rain events and melt events and so on and so forth. There's a perimeter ditch that will be located, it's highlighted on the drawing, that will direct the flow to the pond, which contains contours and grades that will help positive drainage into the pond during rain events. The 3-meter high berm will be constructed at the site to retain the stormwater within the site proper. Stormwater management pond will be constructed at the north portion of the site and will be lined with some sort of an actual pond liner. Quality controls include what has been approved by the MECP through Environmental Compliance ECA for the system. A batch treatment system is being provided by Continental Carbon. The final sewer discharge will meet all applicable governing standards for both municipal and MECP requirements. Next slide. This is a cross section of the berm that'll be located on the perimeter of the property that basically helps the stormwater make its way into the storm pond. Next slide. This is the treatment system that we're planning on using. It's being provided by Continental Carbon. It is charcoal, clay, and carbon activated. All of the water currently escaping the site will now be collected into the pond. From that, it will be retrieved and processed through the system. It'll go into batching tanks, and from there it will be treated through the system. Before anything is discharged, the sampling will be continuous. That will basically render the water clean enough to be discharged in the sewer. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you for the presentation. We will now look to councillors with any questions. I have Councillor Garcia and Councillor Ratzlaff. So I'll start with Councillor Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the presenters. First of all, thank you very much. It's nice to know that, comforting to know that you guys with your expertise are doing all this. I'm trying to understand the objective here, so I can understand what you're saying about a new storm water management system and how you can stop the flow into the sewers, but it then has to be treated on site, I think is what you're saying, and you have these ditches and swales and so on. How long will that stay there? Like, is this something that would be permanent so that if at some time there is a record of site and something can be built on that land, they will have those ditches and that treatment plant there?
That's correct. So basically, until such time as the site is redeveloped and a permanent system is installed, this system would be operating to basically collect, control, and treat the stormwater before it's discharged to the combined sewer system, which goes to the sewage treatment plant before discharge.
Okay, thank you. So you're saying then that any development, if it ever happens, will have to have a replacement system for what you're installing here to treat that water and prevent it from having contaminated water flow out of the site.
Yeah, regardless of any new system that's put in, it has to meet the requirements of sewage discharge.
Okay, and I know that I asked earlier, you resubmitted your work plan. Are you able to, I guess it's up to the owner, are you able to share those work plans with the city and with council?
I can take that question back and ask if that can be shared.
Okay, thank you. And one last question. Any rough estimate of how long it will be before you finish with your work and we can get to the next step, whatever that is?
Well, as Stuart mentioned, by the end of March, it's anticipated that this system will be installed and functional. Concurrent with that work, ongoing assessments of the site are still proceeding. For example, testing soil and groundwater and whatnot for the purposes of evaluating the site conditions and filing future records of site condition.
So if I understand correctly, then sometime in spring to mid 2023, the site could be ready to try to get a record of site condition done. Is that correct?
I think that would be very optimistic.
Okay.
In terms of timeline. The phase 2 site assessment on a property such as this, one, because of the large size of the site and because of the detailed ministry regulated process in terms of what we have to follow to assess all of the historical areas of potential concern, delineate soil and groundwater contamination that might be present. The phase 2 site assessment will be, multiple iterations. So my expectation is it probably wouldn't be completed concurrent with the stormwater management system. It would still be ongoing.
So likely at least until the end of next year is what you're saying?
I can't say for sure in terms of timeline, but that wouldn't surprise me in terms of it. In terms of an estimated timeline.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garcia. We will have Councillor Ratzlaff, followed by Councillors Williamson, McPherson, and Kushner.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. It was really helpful. It would have been great to have that presentation with me when I was knocking on doors during the election. But one of the things I did hear from neighbors when I was knocking on the doors was the noise and the dust. Noise can be grating. I suspect, if there's 26 of those pits, I suspect there was a lot of concrete, and that would have created a lot of noise, smashing that concrete up. So once March rolls around, can neighbors expect the noise to calm down then, or what would be the timeline for that? And are you still putting in place the dust control efforts that we talked about, or that sounded like were being used before?
Yeah, so the pit decommissioning work should be done pretty shortly, I would say in the next month or two at the latest. There will be some work associated with the construction of this system, which some of that concrete busting work has already been completed. In terms of installing the swales around the perimeter of the site, there's some of the old concrete floor that needs to be removed to install that. Once the system is installed, depending on what's needed in terms of assessing the site for the purposes of phase 2 site assessment, my expectation is it would be minimal at that point. But
right, you're talking about the noise specifically? And
yes.
The dust, I guess, too.
Yeah, so Peters, as the contractor, is implementing dust controls when they're doing their work.
Right. My next question was just about, in the presentation, talks about the groundwater tests with the 27 wells. Are those spread out across the property? Like, how many are on the west side, I guess, is what I'm curious about.
Do you mean the west side of the 282 site or the west 285?
Yeah, the
Ontario
west,
Street.
like the closest to the river.
285.
285.
Yeah, so we've installed about 30 plus boreholes on each, monitoring wells on each property. So we have about 60 monitoring wells right now, almost 70, I think, between the two properties. The concentrations of PCBs and groundwater on the 285 site and the 282 site all meet the residential site condition standards.
Awesome. That sounds like almost 70 is more than 27, so that's good to hear. If you look at the east and the west side of the property, 282 and 285, all right?
285, yeah.
Where would you say, like, there's most concern from your perspective? I mean, I know you haven't done the record of conditions yet, but like, where would you see the most work now moving forward and the most contamination you'd expect to be? Like, would it be, where approximately on the property would you have most concern?
Yeah, that's a tricky one to answer right now. We've basically just completed a lot of the phase 2 drilling, and we're still in the process of doing some of the groundwater sampling. So we're basically right now in the process of evaluating all that data, putting it on figures, also compiling all of the historical data that's been collected by others previously. So once we sort of have all that data compiled and put on figures, then we'll have a little better idea of kind of what the next steps are or what areas of the site might be worse than others. Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky part. It's a bit of a tricky one to answer right now. I don't think we're really in a position yet to kind of say, you know, one side is worse than the other or one area is worse than another for dealing with.
All right.
That's part of the phase 2 site assessment work, is evaluating all that data, and we'll literally have thousands of individual data points and analytical results to go through and determine sort of what the next steps are.
So this has been a pretty long process, and like Garcia already talked a little bit about timelines. Rebuilding trust with residents, I think, will be important moving forward because, you know, it's been years, and so trust has been lost. I think some things that would help would be regular updates, some sense of timeline, and then, yeah, like the record of site conditions are really important because right now we're just working off hearsay and we're speculating on what's on that site. So any regular updates that you can give throughout this process, I think, would be much appreciated by everyone. Can we get a sense of when or if records of site condition will be done for the entire site, or like will it be broken up and be done for different parcels? So like 10 Pleasant, I'm assuming the record of site condition, that's most concerning, or that would be kind of top of list. And when could we anticipate receiving that? So like kind of two-part question, like will the record of site conditions be broken up? Or will it be all given to us all at once?
Sure, I can answer some of that. So at minimum, you can only file a record of site condition for a property that's non-contiguous. So for example, 10 Pleasant is separate from 282 by a road. So we would file separate records of site condition for those two properties. The 10 Pleasant Avenue site is a fairly easy one to deal with from a contamination perspective. It's really just shallow contaminated fill, so it's relatively easy to deal with, basically excavating that soil, sending it to a landfill, collecting new samples, and once those samples meet the site condition standards, then you could file a record of site condition. But there's also the complicating factor of the oil water separator that's there. So the record of site condition really wouldn't be able to be filed until that unit is removed. And that unit can't be removed until the new temporary system is installed and designed and basically functioning properly before the old system can be decommissioned. So there's some timing issues with respect to that from those perspectives. In terms of the other sites, they're very large sites. There's a possibility that one or more records of site condition could be filed for each, but we don't really know what the best strategy for filing records of site condition is right now until we kind of go through the motions of the phase 2 to determine what the appropriate management methods would be for whatever contamination might be there.
Awesome, thanks. That's really helpful.
Thank you, Councillor Ratzlaff. One thing I will say, and I just want to caution councillors as they're asking questions. One thing to keep in mind when we talk about concerns in the community and a lack of trust in the process, I do want us all to keep in mind that the people presenting tonight have only been engaged on this site for 2 years. 2 years. So while this process has been ongoing for a very long time, the representatives from Peters have only been there for 2 years, and I would wager, I'm looking at Ms. Kate, that they have been extremely good partners in this to this point. They've been willing to come and make a presentation, and these are steps that we did not see in the past. So I want us to be cognizant of that. I think credit is due to the presenters this evening for coming with this plan, because this is a step that we have not seen previous to 2020. With that, I will look to Councillor Williamson, followed by Councillor McPherson and Councillor Kushner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. 3-2, Mr. Jones. The 26 machine pits, and it's good to know that you've got most of that work done. They would have been the areas of concern to you because they're the deepest, least artificial openings where material or liquids would have flowed to. Is that correct?
Yeah, so as part of the site assessment process, basically you start with a phase 1 site assessment, which looks at the history of the property, what are the potential environmental concerns, and then those are identified, and then the next step is to evaluate those in the phase 2 site assessment. So as part of the phase 2 site assessment, we're drilling boreholes and taking groundwater samples in the vicinity of areas of concern on the site.
Thank you. And then you may have heard my question to Mrs. Groombridge. In terms of using technology, whatever it is, to determine if there's any hidden contaminants in barrels or whatever underground, is there new methods or technologies to try and do the detective work to see if there's anything that might be underground, other than just doing boreholes, I guess?
Yeah, so there are methods you can use to ground penetrating radar. You can do electromagnetic surveys to look for buried tanks and things like that. Sometimes the easiest way on a site is also just to dig a hole and see what's there if you suspect something that's there. So there are methods that you can use. If we suspect that there could have been a former tank in an area, then we might recommend doing something like that.
Okay, and then the storm sewer, these oil grit separators seem to be an issue, and I've looked them up and tried to understand them a bit, but it's somewhat of a filtering system, I gather. I mean, just like a home aquarium where you have to replace the filtration every month or so, or even, I'm not sure what the right analogy is, but I would think that they would need regular maintenance, and then the grit that they're separating and oil would have to be removed on a regular basis. And has that been done?
Yeah, so we call it the East Tilt Plate Separator, which is at 10 Pleasant Avenue. So that unit essentially has multiple chambers. Waters flow through those chambers. It basically slows down the flow so sediment can fall out. There's other chambers that allow like oils and things to collect. So those that East Tilt Plate Separator was just cleaned out very recently in terms of removing basically everything that was inside the first 2 chambers of that unit.
Now, was that the responsibility when General Motors was operating the site? Would they have taken care of that, or whose responsibility would that have been?
Yeah, it was the unit. It was a General Motors unit. They were the ones who installed it, so they would have been responsible for operating it and maintaining it.
Okay, and have you had access to the plans that General Motors had, what they had in place when it was an operating factory?
So we do have some information from historical reports that have been provided to us. There's also some information that we're waiting on from the ministry as well through
Good to hear.
information.
Thank you. And you mentioned that the stormwater events, you're doing stormwater samples monthly. Is that information shared with the ministry?
Yes, that information is provided in the monthly memos that we provide to the ministry.
Great, thank you. And when this temporary surface stormwater system is in place, I take it that will go a long way to reducing the PCB runoffs, but there's still groundwater concerns, and it may not eliminate it. Obviously, it's not going to eliminate it entirely. What would your expectation be once the temporary system is in place?
So a couple things. Once the new temporary system is in place, the discharge to 12 Mile Creek will stop altogether. It will be shut off. It'll be capped. There'll be no flow out to the municipal storm sewer on Thomas Street. So essentially, there'll be nothing more to sample because there'll be no flow from the site to that system any longer. So that'll include sealing the pipe where it leaves the property, and then also sealing where the oil grit separator is at 10 Pleasant, and then eventually removing that unit altogether. In terms of groundwater quality, all the groundwater samples we've collected to date meet the residential land use standards. So we haven't really found any groundwater contamination in terms of PCBs.
Thank you. And that this design with the settling pond, or the pond being on the north side along Carlton Street, I guess that would be mainly driven by the topography.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really involved in the design of that system. There are people who specialize in that in terms of like civil and stormwater engineers who design these things. So I'm assuming they placed it in that location for that particular reason.
Thank you. Last question. Okay, once you get finished with the machine pits, what will be the priority places that you'll want to look at for remediation or for taking measures to control runoff?
Yeah, so once the pits are done, then there'll be a more detailed cleanup of the site surface and the former floor of the plant, which takes up a large percentage of the site. So that's kind of being done already concurrently. Once a pit area is decommissioned, then the surface is cleaned up. So that's kind of still ongoing because we have a few more pits to decommission. So once that's completed, as part of the operation of the system, the treatment system itself operates under what's called environmental compliance approval. So basically there are sampling and monitoring requirements as part of that system. So that will be completed as well.
Thank you. And that, sorry, just on these machine pits, the concrete itself absorbs the contaminants. Is that why the concrete actually has to be removed?
It can, yeah. I mean, concrete can absorb oil. So, I mean, the idea was just to remove the structures altogether. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. One, for future redevelopment, if someone goes into redevelop and they start hitting all these giant machine pits everywhere, it's just kind of a more convenient time to remove them now while we're there. We got them cleaned out. Let's get rid of them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the presenters. I just want to ask, just from your experience and your perspective, the ministry reported, there's been a decrease in the PCBs to the Woodruff manhole. Could you just talk about from your perspective, why the decrease occurred?
Yeah, I mean, there could be lots of reasons why it's decreased, but I think certainly what we've seen in terms of the site itself is a general decrease in concentrations leaving the site based on the efforts that have been completed to basically remove, surface materials and other things on the site.
Thank you. I guess the next question through you, Mr. Mayor, to the presenter. There's been a bit of, I think there's been some community information or conversations about the PCBs that are on the site. Could you just maybe explain what the characteristics of the legacy PCBs on the site are? Like, it's you talked about the pits not having PCBs in it. So could you just a little explanation just about the PCBs that are currently or that are on the site or that you've found? What are the characteristics of them?
Well, in terms of where we found PCBs, we found some PCBs in the concrete cores of the floor, fairly low concentrations, but still some detected. Basically, PCBs were used in a lot of different oils and fluids on the site, from transformers to capacitors and other electrical equipment. It could have been used in other things as well. Just spills during operation, could have affected the floor. We found PCBs in the sediment that basically accumulated in the sewers themselves, which we interpreted was one of the major sources to stormwater. So basically, sand and gravel and things that make their way into the storm sewers, they accumulate in there, they can't get out. Stormwater travels over them, picks up small concentrations of PCBs, which then affects stormwater. So that was the reason why we did the sediment removal activities, to remove those PCB impacted sediments from the site. Can't remember what your other question.
No, that's it. And I guess the final one, and Councillor Retzlaff had a similar question, but just I'm hoping that there will be possibly follow-up presentations, after the ditch and the pond are built, that after a period of time that we'll get another. I'm assuming that you'll be coming back to kind of share with us, the successes of what's happening and what's happening with the site with regards to remediation. I'm not asking about anything else, just remediation.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not really my decision, obviously, to come back and present, but certainly we can take that message back to the owners and see if there's opportunities to present during future meetings, especially successes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kushner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. When I travel on Ontario Street and I look at the site, and I, like most people, say, why isn't there work being done? And your presentation tonight is very reassuring that there is all kinds of work being done. And one question I have, is there an environmental reason why the buildings aren't being taken down in a more expedient manner?
Not from an environmental perspective. There were some residual asbestos containing materials that were in the buildings that were removed fairly recently. I can't remember when they were removed. Stuart might know exactly, but now that those materials have been removed, the demolition could proceed, but I'm not involved in the permitting or anything to do with the demolition, so I can't really comment on the timing of when that work could be done or why it hasn't been done so far.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is with respect to stormwater pond. You indicate that it's temporary, and my question was, why would it be temporary? Why would you not put up a permanent one to avoid any type of duplication? But I think you answered that. You said with the temporary one, you'd quickly prevent any mitigation of PCBs and other contaminants into 12 Mile Creek. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the system can be defined as temporary because the future development plans for the site are not known. So where in the future is the best place to put a pond if it's needed in the future? So for example, if, it may not be needed as part of the future development. We don't really know at this point. So I think it's put in the best place that makes the most sense for right now. And then obviously it'll be reevaluated as the site's redeveloped and those designs happen and stormwater management studies are done for those development plans.
Right. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Kushner. Councillor Phillips.
I pretty well am assured that my question was going to be asked. I was just going to ask if we have any idea of timelines as far as knocking down the building on the west side. And do they foresee any similar problems that they've incurred in knocking that building down?
I don't know anything about the timing of the building demolition. I'm not really sure what you mean by issues that happened in the past either. So unfortunately, I won't be able to answer that, but you could submit that question and perhaps that could be answered.
You don't know if there's any contaminants in that building that you're going to interact with when it comes down?
Well, I know all the asbestos has been removed from those buildings.
Right. So other than that, you're quite sure that there isn't anything else you're going to deal with?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Phillips. Seeing no other hands, I will simply say thank you to Mr. Randall and Mr. Jones. And I believe Councillor Kushner actually said it well. There has been frustration in the past, people concerned about whether work was ongoing, but this presentation tonight very clearly indicates the volume of work that's been done and the tens of thousands of tons of material that have been moved off-site. Councillor Garcia, I see your hand raised. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I know I've asked questions already. Would it be okay for you to ask a couple more questions that I thought of as I listened?
Yep, Councillor, that's fine.
Okay, so I guess to either presenters, some of the residents have told me recently that they smell a rotten egg smell that they have been told is hydrogen sulfide emanating from the site. I know that hydrogen sulfide can be quite, I don't know if poisonous is too strong a word, but it's damaging. Have either of you been aware of such a leak or the existence of hydrogen sulfide in the air?
I'm not aware of anything in that regard, and I'm not aware of anything on the site that could actually be a source of that. I know recently the city was doing some sewer cleanout work in the area, so it could have been related to that. I know when they bring in, for example, like a vacuum truck to clean out sewers, it can be pretty smelly temporarily. So it may be related to that, but I can't say any certainty.
Okay, and I assume the ministry the same. They haven't been aware of any such leak.
I haven't heard of any complaints. We can follow up with the officer and ask.
Councillor, can I ask who the concerns were relayed to, like who they were reported to?
They were residents that contacted me and said they smell a strong rotten egg smell that they were told was hydrogen sulfide, but of course they don't know for sure that that's what it was.
Okay, I'm gonna just ask staff, if residents have concerns, who should they be contacting?
Through the mayor to council, if there's odors being emanated from a site that's currently under construction, my understanding is that complaints should be lodged with the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Labor.
Okay, so I will say to council, I think if residents are forwarding concerns like this, let's please make sure we're directing them if there are concerns about odors to the Ministry of the Environment or the Ministry of Labor. Continue, Councilor Garcia, sorry.
Thank you, and one other question I thought of for you to the ministry, I guess. We've been assured today that the cleanup is proceeding and certainly on the site, and my question is, will the ministry test any of the soil adjacent to the site in case there has been migration? I know the residents, again, have been very concerned about potential contaminants and whether that has caused illness and that kind of thing. Are you satisfied that if the site itself is not showing anything, is it possible that there could have been some migration or leakage into adjacent land that should be tested?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the design of the stormwater collection on the site, both the east and west sides, was such that all of the stormwater flow gets directed through the storm sewers to the oil grit separator and on the west side directly to 12 Mile Creek, and on the east side into the municipal storm sewer. Runoff onto neighboring properties is not a concern for us.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's runoff, and I know we're talking about PCBs, but over the years we have heard about heavy metals like chromium and other contaminants on the site. Is it possible some of that could have migrated outside of the site and should be tested for?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the likely path of migration would be through stormwater movement. And again, the stormwater gets directed to the sewers and through the oil grit separator and not flowing off the site. We would expect that there would be typical urban roadway contamination on the soils surrounding the property. So it would be very challenging to differentiate between what's there just by the residential road use versus what happened on the property. In particular, since the mode of migration would be through stormwater runoff, which is designed not to occur.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, I kept thinking of these as I went through. Through you to Mr. Jones, I believe I'm correct that you said this, but at 10 Pleasant Avenue is a property where there has been an application for development, and I know, as you said, it's surface, there was a parking lot there, but also that separator is on that property, and that has to be totally decommissioned and removed before any development happens there. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be my understanding. Any sort of development plan, I think, includes that corner of the site that I've seen. So I think the plan would be to remove that unit once it's available to do so. And that would be before filing of a record of site condition as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the presenters again.
All right, thank you to the presenters. And thank you to Ms. Groombridge for mitigating some of those concerns that were just raised as well. With that, we have a recommendation to receive the presentation from Stuart Randall and Thomas Jones. Can I have a mover? Councillor McPherson, seconder, Councillor Stevens. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Moving on to item 4. Thank you again to the presenters. The bylaw listed on the council agenda be read a first time, considered and passed. Bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council at the special meeting today. Can I have a mover? Councillor Ratzlaff. Seconder, Councillor Phillips. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Finally, motion to adjourn. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Councillor McPherson. Councillor Stevens. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried.
Well done, Council.